the first thing Walter Dawson noticed wasn't his son's voice, it was the silence. 23 people stood scattered across the backyard, he'd spent 7 years shaping with his own hands. Neighbors, cousins, a few old church friends, and the county clerk waited beneath a white canopy where a long oak table held a stack of documents. Fresh-cut grass carried the smell of spring rain, but no one spoke. Every face was fixed on the same place. Walter's son, Eric, whose jaw had gone rigid as he stared at the folder in Walter's weathered hands. "You can't be serious," Eric finally whispered. Walter looked at him for a long moment, almost forgetting the crowd around them. He remembered a little boy with scraped knees who used to run across empty fields pretending they were castles. He remembered tiny hands gripping his finger after nightmares. He remembered promises. But promises, he'd learned, had expiration dates. "I've never been more serious in my life," Walter said quietly. Across from Eric stood another woman whose expression was harder to read. Judith Collins, 71 years old, had been part of the Dawson family's life for over 3 decades. She had once been Walter's late wife's closest friend, practically family herself. After Margaret passed away, Judith stepped into every conversation Eric refused to have with his grieving father. She'd become his advisor, his sounding board, and eventually the loudest voice telling him what he deserved. Walter had ignored the warning signs. He wasn't going to ignore them anymore. Judith folded her arms. "You're making a terrible mistake." Walter met her eyes. "No," he answered. The mistake was believing gratitude could be inherited. A nervous murmur drifted through the guests. The county clerk cleared his throat. "If everyone is ready, we can proceed." Eric stepped forward so quickly his chair tipped backward onto the lawn. "Dad! Don't do this here." Walter noticed the word, not please, not I'm sorry, just don't. The difference mattered. He slowly opened the folder. 7 years. More than 2,500 mornings had led to this moment, and none of the people standing there knew how it had really begun. 7 years earlier, Walter Dawson had been 68 years old, newly retired after 43 years as a residential carpenter in western Pennsylvania. His knees complained every morning, and arthritis had settled into his hands like an unwanted tenant. Most men his age talked about fishing trips or traveling the country in oversized motorhomes. Walter bought 40 acres of neglected land instead. His wife Margaret had laughed when he'd first shown her the listing. "You're retiring," she'd teased. "Not starting another career." "It's not another career," he'd replied, "it's our legacy." Back then, Eric had been 36, married to Amanda, with 2 young daughters who chased butterflies every time they visited Walter and Margaret's modest farmhouse. One Sunday afternoon, sitting around the kitchen table after church, Eric had mentioned how impossible housing prices had become. "I just want a place where the girls can grow up," he'd said. "Something they'll remember." Walter had looked toward Margaret. She smiled before he even spoke. "You've already decided, haven't you?" He nodded. "I think I have." The plan sounded almost ridiculous to everyone else. Walter would buy inexpensive land outside town. He would build a custom home himself, not quickly, not commercially, piece by piece, every beam carefully selected, every cabinet handcrafted, every inch built with the experience of a lifetime. When it was finished, the house would belong to Eric and his family. No mortgage, no debt, just a father handing his son the greatest gift he could possibly leave behind. Margaret cried the day Walter signed the paperwork. "They'll never forget this." Walter believed her. For the first 2 years, Eric visited almost every weekend. The grandchildren carried tiny toy hammers, Amanda packed lunches, even Judith occasionally stopped by with lemonade, praising Walter's craftsmanship. "This family is lucky to have you," she'd often say. Walter appreciated hearing it, especially because building wasn't as easy as it had once been. Some mornings he couldn't fully close his right hand. Winter froze his joints until every nail felt heavier than the last. There were days he questioned whether his body would let him finish. Then his granddaughters would run across the unfinished floor shouting, "Grandpa, this is going to be my room." Suddenly the pain mattered less. Margaret kept detailed scrapbooks, every phase, fawn, framing, roof wend. She photographed Walter covered in sawdust almost every evening. "You'll want those memories someday," she'd insist. Walter always laughed. "I'll remember," she smiled knowingly. "No, You'll think you will. Halfway through the third year, everything changed. Margaret suffered a stroke while planting tomatoes behind their farmhouse. By the time Walter reached the hospital, she was awake but struggling to speak. She squeezed his hand, then she looked at him with tears gathering in her eyes. The house. Walter leaned closer. I'll finish it. She nodded once, for the girls. Those were among the last clear words she ever spoke. She passed away 3 days later, the funeral blurred together in Walter's memory. People brought casseroles, church members filled pews. Eric cried harder than Walter had ever seen. Judith stayed close to the family, organizing meals, answering phone calls, and handling details Walter barely understood through his grief. For months afterward, she visited almost daily. At first, Walter was grateful. Grief leaves empty rooms inside a person, and Judith seemed determined to keep those rooms from echoing. Then something subtle shifted. She started speaking for Eric. He's overwhelmed. He doesn't want to burden you. They're so busy with the girls. Walter accepted every explanation. After all, life moved on, children grew, jobs demanded attention, people changed. He kept building. Alone the weekends became once a month, then holidays, then only birthdays. Sometimes Eric would promise to visit and cancel an hour beforehand. Work emergency, soccer tournament, Amanda wasn't feeling well. The excuses always sounded reasonable. Walter never complained. Instead, he worked longer. If he couldn't spend time with his family, he could at least build something that proved how much he loved them. By the 5th year, the house had become extraordinary hand-cut oak staircases. Stone fireplace built from rocks. Walter collected himself custom shelves measured perfectly for Margaret's style of books, because she'd once imagined reading stories there to her granddaughters. He even planted 2 maple trees near the front porch. They'll grow with the girls, he'd whispered while covering their roots. One chilly October afternoon, Eric finally visited after nearly 4 months away. Walter couldn't hide his excitement. He gave his son a complete tour, pointing out every detail with the quiet pride only craftsmen understand. The kitchen island is walnut, Walter explained. Solid wood. I saved it from an old church renovation. Eric barely looked. He walked from room to room with his hands in his pockets, saying very little. Judith followed close behind, her eyes moving across the rooms with an expression Walter couldn't quite identify. When they reached the upstairs hallway, Eric stopped beside the master bedroom window. He looked outside for several seconds before turning around. It's nice, he said. Walter smiled. I wanted it to feel like home. Eric hesitated, then he glanced toward Judith. She gave the smallest nod, and in that single moment, though Walter didn't yet understand why, something inside him began to sink. Eric rubbed the back of his neck before speaking again, almost as if he were searching for words that wouldn't sound as harsh as the ones already waiting in his mind. It's just... he began. Walter waited. The bedrooms aren't exactly what Amanda expected. Walter blinked. What do you mean? Eric walked into the master bedroom and stretched both arms toward the walls. They're kind of compact. Walter looked around the room. It measured nearly 17 by 19 feet, larger than the bedroom he and Margaret had shared for 45 years. I figured extra living space downstairs would matter more, Walter replied. Families spend time together in the kitchen and living room. Eric shrugged. People our age think differently. Judith stepped beside him, smiling politely. Design trends have changed, Walter. There was something about the way she said his name that felt different than before. Softer on the surface, sharper underneath. You've built a beautiful home, she continued. But younger buyers expect larger suites. Higher ceilings, bigger closets. Walter frowned. It isn't being built for buyers. No, Judith agreed, but value still matters. Walter let the conversation drift away. He told himself they were only making observations, constructive criticism, nothing more. Yet that evening, sitting alone on his porch after they left, he found himself staring at Margaret's scrapbook instead of eating dinner. He stopped on a photograph, taken during the first year of construction. Eric was smiling in that picture, not politely, not out of obligation, genuinely smiling while holding one end of a roof truss with Walter. Walter touched the photograph with his thumb. What changed? He whispered into the empty house. There was no answer, only silence. Winter settled over Pennsylvania with heavy snow that year. Walter continued working whenever the weather allowed. Some mornings he shoveled paths through knee-deep snow, just to reach the workshop. His neighbor Frank Miller often wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know, Frank," said one icy morning, "most people would have hired contractors years ago." Walter chuckled. "Most people aren't stubborn." Frank looked toward the half-finished house. "No. They're also not building with this much love." Walter smiled but didn't respond. Love wasn't something you could measure with a tape measure. But you could see it. Every perfectly aligned cabinet, every smooth railing, every joint that fit together so tightly it looked seamless. Margaret used to call it invisible craftsmanship. The things nobody notices are usually the things holding everything together. Walter understood that better now than ever. A few weeks later, Eric invited Walter to dinner. It had been months since they'd eaten together. Walter drove into town carrying homemade apple pie, just as Margaret always had. His granddaughters, Lily and Sophie, hugged him tightly at the door. "Grandpa." For a few precious minutes, everything felt normal, then dinner began. Conversation stayed light until Amanda mentioned a new housing development across town. "They're building incredible homes," she said. Eric nodded enthusiastically. 5,000 square feet. Indoor gym, home theater. Walter smiled politely. "Sounds expensive." "It is," Eric admitted. "But that's what people are looking for now." Judith, who had somehow also been invited, took a sip of wine before adding, "Expectations evolve." Walter noticed Amanda avoiding eye contact. She looked uncomfortable, like someone silently hoping a difficult conversation wouldn't happen. It happened anyway. Eric set his fork down. "Dad." Walter looked up. "I've been thinking, I know you've put years into the house." Walter waited patiently, "But maybe," Eric paused, "maybe it's smaller than we originally imagined." The room became painfully quiet. Even the girls stopped talking. Walter laid his napkin across his lap. "Smaller." Eric leaned forward. "We're raising 2 teenagers now. They'll want privacy, friends, eventually college visits." Walter nodded slowly. "I accounted for that. There are 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a large family room." Eric sighed. "I know, but compared to newer homes," Judith finished the sentence. "It feels modest." Walter looked from Judith to Eric, then back again. Something clicked, not loudly, quietly, like an old lock finally turning. These weren't Eric's words, at least not entirely. Judith had always admired expensive things, new cars, luxury kitchens, furniture. She'd once criticized Margaret's farmhouse for being quaint. Margaret had laughed it off. Walter remembered thinking then that some people confused price with value. Now he wondered whether Eric had started believing the same thing. He picked up his glass of water. "Tell me something." Eric nodded cautiously. "If I hadn't built this house, if I'd simply handed you the money, would you still think it was too small?" Eric hesitated. "I don't know." Walter noticed he hadn't said no. The drive home felt longer than usual. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield while old country songs played softly on the radio. Walter barely heard them. He kept replaying 3 words. Too small, modest. Not once had Eric asked how Walter's arthritis was doing. Not once had he mentioned the thousands of hours his father had invested. Only square footage. That night, Walter couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, he walked through the unfinished house, carrying nothing but a flashlight. Every room held memories. Here was the window Margaret insisted should face sunrise. Here was the staircase Walter rebuilt twice, because the first version creaked. Here was the porch swing he'd carved for Amanda, after she mentioned wanting 1 year earlier. He stopped inside what would become the dining room. Moonlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Walter suddenly realized something heartbreaking. He knew every nail in this house, every board, every hidden support beam, but he no longer knew his son. Spring brought progress. The exterior stonework was completed. Landscaping began. Neighbors slowed their cars, just to admire the craftsmanship. One Saturday afternoon an elderly woman named Eleanor Brooks pulled into the driveway. Walter recognized her immediately. She'd taught English at the local high school decades earlier. After retiring, she'd become active in community charities. She stepped out carrying a basket of blueberry muffins. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Walter smiled. "Not at all." She looked around with amazement. "I've been driving past this place for years. I finally had to see it up close." Walter gave her a tour, unlike others, Eleanor asked questions that surprised him. What inspired this window placement? Why did you choose oak instead of maple? Did you carve these moldings yourself? She noticed details. Real details. At the fireplace she ran her fingers gently across the stone. This isn't just construction. It's storytelling. Walter laughed softly. My wife would have liked hearing that. Eleanor noticed the sadness behind his smile. You still miss her? Every day, she nodded. So do I. My husband passed 9 years ago. For a while neither of them spoke. Grief recognized grief without needing introductions. Before leaving, Eleanor glanced back toward the house. Whoever ends up living here, they're receiving something priceless. Walter thanked her, but after she drove away, her words lingered. Whoever ends up living here, for the first time in 7 years, Walter found himself wondering whether he had been asking the wrong question. Not odd who deserved the house, but who would actually understand it. He quickly pushed the thought aside. Of course it belonged to Eric. That had always been the plan. Still, plans had a strange habit of changing when people did. 2 weeks later, Walter received an invitation to attend a charity fundraising dinner hosted by the local historical society. Judith was on the organizing committee. Eric called personally. You should come. It'll be good for you, Walter agreed. He had no idea that one conversation at that dinner would reveal exactly how Judith had been influencing his son, and once he heard it, nothing between them would ever be the same. Walter almost declined the invitation. The morning of the fundraisers, crowded events had never appealed to him, and ever since Margaret passed, he found himself leaving gatherings early. Too many people wanted to tell him how strong he was. Too many offered sympathy without realizing that grief didn't disappear because someone meant well. Still, Eric had called personally. That mattered. So, Walter ironed his only navy blazer, polished the same brown shoes he'd worn to church for years, and drove into town. The Historical Society had rented the old train depot, restoring it into a banquet hall, filled with polished wood, antique lanterns, and framed photographs of the county's early settlers. The room buzzed with conversation. Walter had barely stepped inside before several former clients surrounded him. I still tell people about the cabinets you built. My porch is 25 years old and still doesn't squeak. You don't find craftsmen like you anymore. Walter thanked each of them, embarrassed by the attention. Across the room he spotted Eric and Amanda, speaking with Judith. Amanda waved warmly. Eric smiled. Judith offered only a polite nod before returning to her conversation. Walter didn't think much of it. Not yet. Dinner passed pleasantly enough. There were speeches about preserving local landmarks, auctions for handmade quilts, and stories about families who had shaped the town over generations. Walter relaxed for the first time in months. Maybe he had been imagining things. Maybe everyone was simply busy. After dessert, he excused himself and wandered into the hallway searching for the restroom. As he rounded the corner, he heard familiar voices coming from a side lounge. Normally, he would have walked away. Instead, one sentence stopped him cold. He doesn't even realize what that property is worth. Judith. Walter froze. Another voice answered. It was Eric. I know, but I can't exactly push him. Judith laughed softly. You don't have to. Walter stood motionless behind the partly closed door. He still thinks he's building a family home, Judith continued. In 5 years that entire area will be surrounded by new developments. The land alone could be worth 3 or 4 times what it is today. Walter felt something tighten in his chest. Eric sighed. Amanda thinks we should just move in. Judith answered immediately. Of course she does. But think bigger. Walter slowly leaned closer, his heart pounding. If you sell after the market peaks, Judith said, you could buy something truly impressive. Eric didn't respond right away. Finally he said quietly, Dad would hate that. He doesn't need to know immediately. Walter closed his eyes. For 7 years, he hadn't simply been building a home, someone had been calculating an investment. Judith spoke again. And honestly, the house is charming, but it's still too small for your future. Walter had heard enough. He stepped backward before either of them noticed him. His hands trembled. Not from age, but from disappointment. Outside, cool evening air hit his face. He sat alone on a wooden bench beneath an old maple tree, staring across the parking lot. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes when a truth you've been refusing to believe, finally introduces itself. Several minutes later someone sat beside him. I thought I'd find you here. Walter looked up. It was Eleanor Brooks. She had volunteered at the fundraiser. You disappeared during dessert, she said gently. Walter forced a smile. I needed some air. She studied him for a moment. My students used to try that expression before telling me they hadn't done the reading. Walter chuckled despite himself. I suppose I wasn't very convincing. No. She waited patiently. Walter appreciated that she didn't rush to fill the silence. Eventually he spoke. Have you ever spent years building something, only to realize the people you built it for were waiting to sell it? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead she looked toward the dark outline of the hills beyond town. My husband owned a small bookstore. Walter listened. When online retailers started taking over, several investors offered to buy the building. He refused, not because of the money, but because he believed some things were worth more than profit. She turned toward Walter. After he died, people told me I was foolish for donating the building to the public library. Walter looked surprised. You donated it. She smiled. Best decision I ever made. They turned it into a reading center for children. Walter thought about that for a long moment. You gave away something valuable. I gave it to people who valued it. The distinction landed deeper than she probably realized. Before Walter could respond, Eric emerged from the building. There you are. His smile looked forced. Dad, you left without saying anything? I needed some fresh air. Eric glanced briefly toward Eleanor. Oh, Judith appeared a few seconds later. There you are, Walter. We were worried. Walter met her eyes. For the first time in 30 years, he wondered whether she had ever actually worried about him, or only about what he owned. The ride home was quiet, too quiet. That night Walter unlocked a cedar chest in his bedroom. Inside were Margaret's journals. She had written almost every evening for decades. Walter rarely read them. They felt too personal. Tonight felt different. He carefully opened the final journal. Most entries described ordinary things. Garden vegetables, church picnics, the girls learning to ride bicycles. Then one page caught his attention. It had been written 4 years earlier. Walter recognized the date immediately. The day before Margaret's stroke. Her handwriting was steady. Walter believes he's building Eric a house. I think he's really building a lesson. Walter frowned. He continued reading. Love should never be measured by whether someone accepts the gift, only by whether it was given sincerely. If Eric ever forgets that. The sentence stopped. There was no ending. The page ended there. Walter stared at the unfinished thought. A lump formed in his throat. Margaret had seen something. Perhaps, long before he had. The next morning he returned to the construction site before sunrise. Instead of working, he simply sat on the front porch. Birds filled the maple trees with song. The house stood quietly behind him waiting. Around 9 o'clock, Frank Miller drove over. You aren't wearing your tool belt. Walter smiled faintly. I needed to think. Frank sat beside him. After years of friendship, he knew better than to interrupt silence. Eventually Walter asked, Frank, if someone spends years preparing a gift, does the recipient automatically deserve it? Frank scratched his gray beard. No. Walter looked over. I've known men who inherited farms they destroyed within months. I've also known strangers who cared for borrowed land like it belonged to their grandparents. He shrugged. Ownership and appreciation aren't the same thing. Walter nodded slowly. That afternoon he visited his attorney. Not to change anything, not yet. He simply wanted to understand his options. Attorney Daniel Harper had known Walter for nearly 20 years. After listening carefully, he folded his hands across the desk. So the property is still entirely in your name. Dobb, yes. And you've never signed a transfer agreement? No. Daniel nodded. Then legally, the decision remains yours. Walter didn't answer. Instead he looked out the office window toward the courthouse across the street. For the first time since starting the project, he realized something simple. The house wasn't a promise, it was a choice. And, choices could change. As he walked back to his truck, his phone rang. Amanda. She rarely called him directly. Walter? Her voice sounded nervous. I need to tell you something. He leaned against the truck. What is it? There was a long pause. Then she quietly said the words that confirmed every fear he'd tried to dismiss. I don't think Eric has told you about the meeting, Judith. arranged with a real estate developer. Walter's grip tightened around the phone. What meeting? Amanda took a shaky breath. It was about your house. Walter didn't answer immediately. He stood beside his truck in the attorney's parking lot, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Amanda, he said at last, his voice calm despite the pounding in his chest, start from the beginning. On the other end of the line, Amanda let out a slow breath. It wasn't supposed to happen this soon. What wasn't? The meeting. Walter closed his eyes. Tell me. About 3 months ago, Judith introduced Eric to a developer named Charles Benton. She said he specialized in luxury communities. Walter listened without interrupting. They met twice, Amanda continued. The first meeting was just to discuss the area. The second. She hesitated. The second was about your property. Walter stared across the courthouse lawn. They've never even owned it. I know, they talked anyway. Amanda sounded ashamed, though none of it was her doing. They believed that once you officially gifted the house, they'd have enough equity to sell immediately. Walter swallowed. Oh. So they already had a buyer, they were exploring offers. The distinction hardly mattered. A silence settled between them. Finally Amanda spoke again. I argued with Eric. Walter frowned. You did? He said Judith was helping us think about the future. And what did you say? I asked him how someone could spend 7 years accepting your sacrifices while secretly planning to cash them in. Walter's eyes drifted toward the sky. Clouds rolled slowly over the courthouse dome. He didn't answer. Amanda's voice cracked. I don't recognize him anymore. Walter thanked her quietly before ending the call. He sat in his truck for nearly 20 minutes without starting the engine. The pain wasn't that Eric had considered selling the house. It was that the decision had been made before Walter had even finished building it. The dream had already been converted into numbers on someone else's spreadsheet. That afternoon, Walter returned to the property. He walked through every room more slowly than ever before. The kitchen smells faintly of fresh walnut. The staircase reflected sunlight through the tall windows. Margaret had insisted upon. He paused beside the fireplace. Ended into one corner was a tiny stone with a barely noticeable white streak. Margaret had picked it herself. It's imperfect. Walter had said years earlier. She smiled. So are we. That's why it belongs. He ran his fingers across it now. For the first time, he wondered whether the house had ever truly belonged to Eric at all. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. A black SUV rolled into the driveway. Walter recognized neither the vehicle nor the man who stepped out. Tall, expensive suit, confident smile. You must be Walter Dawson. Walter nodded cautiously. And you are? Charles Benton. Walter's expression didn't change. The developer, Charles, extended a hand. I've heard wonderful things about your craftsmanship. Walter ignored the handshake. What can I do for you? Charles withdrew his hand without embarrassment. I was driving nearby and thought I'd introduce myself. Walter remained silent. Charles looked toward the nearly completed house. It's exceptional. It'll be one of the finest homes in this county. Walter simply waited. Experienced carpenters knew patience. Experienced businessmen usually disliked it. Charles eventually continued. I understand your son has tremendous plans. Walter looked directly at him. My son doesn't own this property. Charles blinked. No, but he eventually will. Walter didn't answer. Charles smiled politely. Regardless, development around here is accelerating. I represent several investors. If you, or your family, ever decide to discuss opportunities. He handed Walter a business card. Walter accepted it without looking. Charles climbed back into his SUV. Just before closing the door, he added, sometimes memories are valuable, but land is priceless. The vehicle disappeared down the road. Walter looked at the card for several seconds. Then he folded it in half, then again, until it fit neatly inside his pocket. That evening Frank stopped by carrying 2 fishing poles. You've worked enough. Walter smiled. I haven't fished in years. Exactly. An hour later they sat beside a quiet lake. Neither man caught much, neither seemed to care. Eventually Frank asked, want to tell me what's really happening? Walter told him everything, the meetings, the developer, Amanda's phone call, Judith, Eric. Frank listened without interrupting. When Walter finished, Frank skipped a small stone across the water. I've been wondering when you'd see it. Walter looked over. You knew? Not everything. But enough. What do you mean? Frank sighed. About a year ago I overheard Judith talking after church. Walter waited. She said your property would be the family's retirement jackpot. Walter stared at him. You never told me. I hoped I was wrong. So did I. The two old friends watched the sun sink below the trees. Finally Frank asked the question Walter had been avoiding. What are you going to do? Walter answered honestly. I don't know. But deep inside, he was beginning to. Over the following weeks, Walter stopped discussing the house with Eric. He still answered phone calls, still visited his granddaughters, still attended Sunday church. Nothing appeared different, only Walter knew that everything had changed. Instead of rushing to finish construction, he slowed down. Every decision became deliberate. Every document organized, every receipt filed. Every photograph Margaret had taken was carefully scanned into digital folders. Attorney Daniel Harper noticed immediately. You're preparing? Walter nodded. I've spent my entire life building things. It's time I protected one. Daniel smiled. Good, documentation wins arguments long before courtrooms do. Meanwhile, Judith became unusually attentive. She started visiting the property again, bringing homemade cookies, complimenting the landscaping, asking when the deed transfer would happen. Walter answered every question politely. I'm still finishing details. There are inspections, paperwork, no rush. Judith always smiled, but disappointment flickered across her face before she hid it. One afternoon she arrived unexpectedly, while Walter was planting flowers near the front porch. Margaret would have loved these. Walter nodded. She chose the colors years ago. Judith looked around. You know, this place is worth much more than either of us imagined. Walter kept digging. Probably. You should transfer it soon. Walter looked up. Why? So Eric can begin planning. Walter wiped dirt from his gloves. What kind of planning? Judith hesitated for half a second. Family planning. Walter noticed, it was the smallest pause, yet it spoke louder than words. That evening Amanda arrived alone. She looked exhausted. I needed to see you. Walter invited her inside. Over coffee she finally admitted the truth she'd been carrying for months. Eric signed a letter of intent. Walter's cup stopped halfway to the table. What? Not a sales contract, but a non-binding agreement. Charles wanted first rights if the property became available. Walter said nothing. Amanda reached into her purse. I made a copy. She slid several folded pages across the table. Walter unfolded them slowly. His name wasn't anywhere on the document, neither was his signature, but the address was unmistakable. His land, his house, his dream, being discussed as though it were already someone else's. Amanda looked at him with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry. Walter reached across the table and gently covered her hand. You have nothing to apologize for. You tried. She nodded silently. Before leaving, she stopped at the front door. Can I ask you something? Of course. If you could go back 7 years, would you still build it? Walter looked around the quiet house. He thought about Margaret, the girls, every sunrise spent hammering nails, every blister, every memory. A slow smile appeared. Yes, Amanda looked surprised. Even now? Walter nodded. I'd still build the house, I just wouldn't give it to someone who couldn't see what was really inside it. Amanda left without another word. Walter locked the door behind her. Then he carried the copied agreement into his study, and placed it beside Margaret's unfinished journal. He stared at both for a long time. One revealed greed. The other reminded him of love, and somewhere between those two truths, Walter finally understood exactly what he was going to do. Walter didn't tell anyone about the letter of intent, not Eric, not Judith, not even Frank. Instead, he locked the copy inside the same fire-proof cabinet where Margaret had kept family records for years. Every receipt, blueprint, inspection report, photograph, and handwritten note now sat neatly organized beside it. If anyone ever questioned what the house meant, or who had built it, Walter intended to let the facts speak louder than his disappointment. The next morning he arrived at the property before sunrise. The final stretch of construction had begun. Kitchen fixtures were installed. The porch swing Margaret had dreamed about hung from heavy iron chains. The maple trees, once thin saplings, now cast enough shade to cool the front yard. Walter stood in the driveway, listening to birds instead of power tools. For 7 years, he'd rushed toward a finish line. Now he understood the finish line wasn't the house. It was the decision waiting beyond it. A week later, attorney Daniel Harper called. The title search is complete. Walter drove into town that afternoon. Daniel spread several documents across his desk. Everything is clean, no liens, no claims, no legal complications. Walter nodded. And if I choose not to transfer ownership? Daniel leaned back. That's entirely your right. What if my son challenges it? He can challenge anything. Daniel smiled slightly. Winning is another matter. Walter appreciated lawyers who answered honestly instead of dramatically. There is one more thing, Daniel continued. I've reviewed the developer's letter Amanda gave you. Walter looked up. It doesn't create ownership, but it does show intent. Walter folded his hands. Intent to profit, exactly. Daniel paused. If this ever becomes emotional, which I suspect it will, keep your focus on documented facts, not accusations. Walter nodded. I've spent 43 years measuring twice before cutting once. Daniel laughed. I suppose legal strategy isn't much different. Driving home, Walter stopped at the cemetery. Margaret's headstone overlooked a quiet hill where wildflowers had begun blooming. He placed fresh daisies beside the stone. I finally understand, he said softly. The breeze stirred the grass. You weren't asking me to finish the house. You were asking me to protect what it stood for. He remained there for nearly an hour. When he left, his steps felt lighter than they had in months. The following Sunday, the entire family gathered for Lily's 17th birthday. Walter almost stayed home. Instead, he wrapped an antique woodworking toolbox that had belonged to his own grandfather. Lily had recently discovered a love for woodworking in her high school shop class. The moment she opened the gift, her eyes filled with tears. Grandpa! She carefully lifted the worn wooden plane from the box. This is beautiful. Walter smiled. It built 3 generations of furniture. I think it's ready for a 4th. Eric watched quietly from across the room. Judith, however, frowned. It's awfully old. Lily immediately shook her head. No, it's history. Walter noticed Judith's expression harden for only a second before she forced another smile. That tiny moment confirmed something important. The younger generation still understood value. They simply hadn't been given enough chances to prove it. Later that afternoon, Eric followed Walter onto the back porch. Dad. Walter turned. I've been meaning to ask, when do you think the house will officially be finished? Walter answered without hesitation. Very soon. Eric smiled. That's great. Amanda's already looking at decorating ideas. Walter nodded politely, and I've spoken with a financial planner. Walter remained silent. Eric continued. If we manage everything correctly, the property could open a lot of doors. Walter studied his son's face. There was excitement there, hope, but none of it had anything to do with family dinners, grandchildren, or memories. It was about opportunity. We'll talk soon. Walter said quietly. Eric looked relieved. I appreciate that. As Eric walked back inside, Walter couldn't shake one painful realization. His son wasn't trying to hurt him. He genuinely believed this was practical. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had slowly been replaced by entitlement, and Eric no longer recognized the difference. 3 days later, Judith invited Walter to lunch. He accepted. She chose the nicest restaurant in town. After ordering, she leaned forward with an unusually warm smile. Walter, we've known each other for over 30 years. We have. I've always considered you family. Walter nodded. So have I. She reached across the table. Then let me give you some friendly advice. Walter waited. Don't delay the transfer. He raised an eyebrow. Why not? Life is unpredictable. She lowered her voice. If something happened to you before the paperwork was completed, probate could become complicated. Walter looked at her carefully. You're worried about my estate. I'm worried about Eric. Walter let several seconds pass before replying. Funny, I thought people who cared about me usually asked how I was feeling before asking about my paperwork. Judith's smile faltered. I didn't mean, I know exactly what you meant. For the first time in years, Walter stood before lunch arrived. I hope you enjoy your meal. He walked out without looking back. That evening, Frank laughed after hearing the story. Took you long enough. Walter smiled. I've never been quick to judge people. No, but once you do. Walter finished the sentence. I don't forget. Construction officially ended 2 weeks later. The county inspector signed the final approval, every permit had passed, every requirement had been met. Walter walked alone, through the completed house one last time. Sunlight poured through Margaret's favorite windows, the stone fireplace glowed softly in the afternoon light. The walnut kitchen reflected years of careful sanding and patient hands, nothing needed fixing, nothing remained unfinished, except one decision. He picked up his phone. "Daniel. I'm ready." The attorney answered calmly, "I'll prepare everything, no transfer documents." Walter smiled, "I have something else in mind." 3 days later, Daniel arrived carrying a leather briefcase. Inside were entirely different papers than anyone expected. Walter signed each one carefully, every page, every signature, every witness line. When they finished, Daniel closed the folder. "Are you certain?" Walter looked around the room one last time. "I've never been more certain." Daniel stood, "Then I'll arrange the public signing." Walter nodded. "I want everyone there, my family, the neighbors, the people who watched this place rise from an empty field." Daniel smiled knowingly. "I thought you might." Word spread quickly. Eric called almost immediately. "A public signing?" Walter answered simply. "Yes, I thought it would be nice to celebrate." Eric sounded excited. "So, it's finally happening." Walter looked out toward the front porch where Margaret's swing moved gently in the wind. "Yes, it finally is." Across town, Judith received the same invitation. She smiled to herself. After years of waiting, she believed everything had fallen perfectly into place. Neither she nor Eric noticed one important detail printed near the bottom of the invitation. It didn't say property transfer ceremony. It simply read, "A celebration of gratitude and legacy." The difference seemed insignificant. In just a few days, they would discover it changed everything. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze that carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the property. White folding chairs lined the front lawn. Neighbors chatted beneath a rented canopy, and the maple trees Walter had planted years earlier swayed gently over the completed home. People admired every detail. "The stonework is incredible. I've never seen trim this precise. Looks like something out of a magazine." Walter thanked them with quiet smiles, but his attention stayed fixed on the front porch. Margaret would have loved seeing the house alive with laughter. She had always believed a home wasn't measured by its size, but by the memories it protected. At precisely 11 o'clock, attorney Daniel Harper arrived with the county clerk. They carried a leather portfolio, and placed it carefully on the oak table. A few minutes later, Eric pulled into the driveway with Amanda and the girls. Eric stepped out wearing his best suit. He looked happier than Walter had seen him in years. "Dad." Walter embraced him warmly. "You look good." "Do you?" Judith arrived moments later in a silver sedan. She walked confidently toward Walter. "I knew you'd do the right thing." Walter smiled politely. "I certainly hope so." She interpreted the remark exactly the way she wanted. Neighbors settled into their seats as Daniel stepped forward. "Thank you all for coming today. This house represents 7 years of extraordinary craftsmanship, sacrifice, and dedication." He turned toward Walter. "Mr. Dawson has asked that today's signing be witnessed by the community that watched this dream become reality." Everyone applauded. Eric looked proudly toward the house. Judith folded her hands with quiet satisfaction. Daniel opened the leather portfolio. "Before the documents are signed, Mr. Dawson would like to say a few words." Walter slowly approached the front of the gathering. For several seconds he simply looked at the house, then at his family, then at the people who had supported him for years. "When I started building this home," he began, "I believed I was building a gift." His voice remained calm. "My late wife, Margaret, and I dreamed of watching our grandchildren grow up here." He smiled toward Lily and Sophie. "You girls were little enough to swing toy hammers while I poured the foundation." The sisters smiled through watery eyes. Walter continued, "Every beam in this house carries a memory. I carved the staircase after Margaret picked the design. I planted the maple trees because she wanted shade for future summers. I built the porch swing because Amanda once mentioned she'd always wanted one." Amanda covered her mouth. Walter paused. "For 7 years. I believed love alone was enough." Silence settled over the crowd, but over time I learned something difficult. A gift without gratitude eventually becomes an expectation. Eric's smile slowly faded. Walter looked directly at him. My son. I have loved you every day of your life. I still do. Nothing in his voice suggested anger. Only sadness. But love doesn't require me to ignore what I've seen. Walter nodded toward Daniel. My attorney has copies of documents showing that plans were being made to sell this property, before it was ever given away. Gasps spread through the audience. Eric's face turned pale. Dad. Walter gently raised one hand. I'm not sharing these papers to embarrass anyone, I'm sharing them because truth deserves daylight. Judith suddenly stepped forward. That's completely unfair. Walter looked at her. No, what's unfair is treating 7 years of sacrifice like an investment portfolio. Daniel quietly handed several copies to the county clerk, who distributed them to Eric and Judith. Eric's hand shook as he recognized the letter of intent. He looked toward Amanda. You gave him this? Amanda nodded slowly. I couldn't keep lying. Judith quickly interrupted. It wasn't a contract, it was only a discussion. Walter answered calmly. Exactly, a discussion about selling something that wasn't yours. The crowd remained completely silent. No one wanted to interrupt the truth unfolding before them. Eric looked at his father. I never meant to hurt you. Walter believed him. I know, you simply stopped seeing what mattered. Eric lowered his eyes. I thought we'd eventually build something bigger. Walter smiled sadly. I already did. He pointed toward his chest. In here. Tears filled Amanda's eyes. Even several neighbors quietly wiped away tears. Daniel stepped forward once more. Mr. Dawson, the documents are ready. Walter nodded. Please. Daniel opened the final folder. This property, along with the surrounding acreage, will not be transferred to Eric Dawson. Judith's mouth fell open. Eric stood frozen. Daniel continued reading. Instead, ownership is hereby transferred to the Margaret Dawson Community Foundation. Confused whispers spread across the lawn. Daniel smiled. The foundation's purpose is to preserve this home as a tuition-free woodworking and life skills center for young people, veterans, and retirees wishing to learn traditional craftsmanship. The crowd erupted into applause. Frank laughed louder than anyone. I knew you had something up your sleeve. Walter smiled. The house will remain exactly as Margaret imagined. A place where families are built, not bought. Daniel continued. Mr. Dawson has also established scholarship funds using his retirement investments to provide tools, apprenticeships and educational opportunities for local students. Lily burst into tears. Grandpa, Walter opened his arms. She hugged him tightly. I'll volunteer here. So will I. Sophie added immediately. Walter smiled through moist eyes. I'd like that. Eric slowly walked toward his father. I don't deserve forgiveness. Walter looked at him quietly. Forgiveness isn't earned, it's chosen. Eric wiped away tears. I let other people convince me success meant more square footage. Walter nodded. I know, I'm sorry. Walter embraced his son. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but it was honest. Judith remained standing alone near the chairs. No one looked angry at her. Something worse, they looked disappointed. She quietly placed the unsigned copy of the invitation back into her purse. Without another word, she walked toward her car. Walter didn't stop her. Consequences rarely needed shouting, sometimes they simply arrived. As guests toured the house one final time, Eleanor Brooks approached Walter on the porch. You found the right owners after all. Walter smiled. No, I found the right purpose. She looked around as children ran across the front lawn. Margaret's porch swing moved gently in the breeze. The maple trees had grown tall enough to shade nearly the entire yard. You know, Eleanor said softly, your wife would have been proud. Walter looked toward the sky. I hope so. Several months later, the Margaret Dawson Community Foundation officially opened its doors. Teenagers learned woodworking beside retired craftsmen. Veterans built furniture for families rebuilding their lives. Grandparents brought grandchildren to weekend workshops. Every finished project carried a small brass plaque near the entrance. It read, a home becomes valuable not because of what it costs, but because of what it gives. Eric volunteered every Saturday, not because anyone required him to, because he wanted his daughters to understand the lesson he had learned too late. Amanda managed community events. Frank taught basic carpentry. Eleanor organized the library corner using books Margaret had collected for decades. Walter no longer spent every day swinging a hammer. Instead, he sat on the porch watching laughter echo through the house he had built with aging hands and an unbroken heart. One afternoon, a young boy finishing his first birdhouse asked him, "Mr. Dawson, why didn't you just sell this place and retire somewhere warm?" Walter smiled. He looked around at the busy workshop, the grandchildren laughing, beneath the maple trees, and the porch, swing, moving gently in the wind. Then he answered with the same quiet wisdom that had carried him through every betrayal. Because houses shelter people. He paused. But legacies teach them how to become better.